Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the all-compassionate, the all-merciful. We are still in chapter 1 of the Fusus al-Hikam. Today we're going to be discussing a tough passage, a tough topic, which honestly, even for me, it took years to realize, but after I realized that this explanation is going to make things much easier and you're not going to be having that difficulty. Now, if you just read any translation of the Fusus until the part we studied, and if you want to start the new part, you will realize that all of a sudden, all the discussion shifts from fixed entities to universals, umūr kulliyya, universal realities, which better be translated as universals. Why does he do that? The switch that happens all of a sudden is not random at all. Ibn Arabi seeks to establish something, but he doesn't bother establishing the connections much, and he leaves it to us to establish those relationships. And we're going to see why all of a sudden things changed from fixed entities to universals. What is the difference between a universal and a fixed entity? Universals for Ibn Arabi is the human counterpart of fixed entities in God's knowledge. We said every existent entity has a fixed entity, like an idea, in God's knowledge, in God's mind. Now, applying the same to human beings' mind, those ideas are called universals. For example, we have the universal umūr kulli of humanity. We have the universal of generosity. Generosity applies to me as a human being. Generosity applies to God as a transcendental being. Human being applies to me, and it applies to someone from other countries. So you see, these are universal properties that are in human mind, human intellect. The sudden shift you experience in what you read in your translations is because of this. Ibn Arabi wants to establish the connection between the divine essence, which is apparently invisible, and the existent entities. So an invisible entity and visible entities. But in order to make this for us more understandable, he starts with a smaller scale. He starts with the relationship between the universals, the realities that are in our minds, and the existent entities. From there, he says, look, even though they do not exist as such in the external world, but there is a relationship between the universals and human mind and existent entities. From there, he's going to say, look, one part was non-existent, one part was existent, therefore we established the relationship. So now let's take a further step. Now let's talk about the relationship between existent entities and existent entities. And establishing this relationship is easier according to Ibn Arabi, because in the former case we had only one part was visible, existent entities. Here, there are two sides that are visible, existent entities in the material world. The relationship between me and a tree, the relationship between me and that camera that is recording. From there, he has taken two steps. Number one, relationship between the universals, human mind, not God, and the existent entities. Relationship established, we're going to see how. Then relationships between the existent entities and existent entities. Then he's going to say, look, we established these two connections, now we're going to take it to a larger scale. He's going to talk about the relationship between God and a transcendental being and the existent entities and the beings in the material world. That is the whole story. That is the aim in what we're going to be discussing, Ibn Arabi's aim in what we're going to be examining. We're going to start from the first step, the relationship between the universals in human mind and existent entities. Ibn Arabi says, umūr kulliyya, that is universal realities, universal entities, let's call them universals. Universal realities are non-existent. They do not exist in the outside world. They have mental existence, right? Consider this, when I say human not like as one individual, but as a universal entity, idea in your mind. That humanity does not exist outside. There are instances of humanity that are outside your mind, and we apply this to those instances. Think about a tree. The tree that is in your mind right now, when I say a tree, when you think of treeness, that doesn't exist outside, that's in your mind. In Islamic philosophy, we call these quiddities, and if you remember from our fixed entities discussion, that the entities, that the ideas that dwelled in God's knowledge, we also tried to call them quiddities, but carefully, because in Islamic philosophy, quiddities are referred as a term only to the universals in human mind, not to necessarily what they are in God's mind. But let's end that detour and come back here. Universal entities do not exist in the outside world, beyond your mind. But, says Ibn Arabi, they determine everything about the existent entities. The universals are nothing other than the existent entities. They are two sides of a coin. They are manifest as they are in the existent external world, and they are hidden in the sense that they are in human mind. The existent entities, says Ibn Arabi, cannot exist without universals, in the sense that we cannot have an external entity that does not have a universal reality in human mind. And the relationship between what is temporal and what is not is the same with universals. Let's consider two universals, knowledge and life. The relationship between these universals and two cases, let's have in our minds. First, the relationship between these two universals and the human being, who is temporal, who is bound by time, and the relationship between these universals and the divine essence, which or who is not temporal. Concerning life, we say that God exists, and we also say that humans exist. Both of them, in both cases, the same life applies, but we're going to see the difference. We say that human knows, and we say that God knows. God knows, human knows. God exists, human beings exist. But the mode of their existence is different. Human being exists contingently. God exists necessarily. We're going to focus on that later on. So we see that life is one, but it is applied in different modes. The reality of life is one. The reality of knowledge is also one. But we see that God knows and humans know. Again, the difference is this, says Ibn Arabi, when we say human knows, human knowledge is created, but God's knowledge is eternal. That is what distinguishes the two. Otherwise, the same reality applies to both. Now, here is a very important assertion. Ibn Arabi says, consider knowledge. Knowledge determines its instance. There is a human being who, he says, knows. So knowledge determines that knower. The principles determine that instance. But that knower himself or herself also determines the knowledge, he says. How does that happen? The mode of knowledge changes with the person it is applied to. That is how it is determined. That is how the knower determines knowledge. Knowledge is created in reference to human being, but knowledge is eternal in reference to God as a transcendental, non-temporal being. Therefore, says Ibn Arabi, the relationship between knowledge and knower is determining and determined. That is, knowledge is both determining and determined. In other words, universals are both determining and determined. Universals are non-existent, but their principles, their effects are applied to instances. But universals do not undergo distinction or individualization, that is particularization, in reference to the cases each universal is applied to. Like, it's not that when we say humanity as a universal, it's not that humanity is applied to, like, broken into parts, individualized, particularized into, let's say, 7 billion people. It doesn't work like that. The universal just is. Its reality is one, and it is applied to different instances without undergoing distinction and without particularization. Then Ibn Arabi concludes that now that you see the relationship between the universals and the existent entities is established, now our job is easier. In this case, when we were trying to establish the connection, the relationship between the universals and the existent entities, one side of the story was non-existent. We do not see them in the outside world. Now we realize that there is a relationship established there and the universals are determined and determining. Now, case 1 closed, case 2. He says, now that we handle this, our job will be easier to establish the relationship between existent entities. That existent entities are, the effect, influence each other and are affected by each other. With that second premise, he's going to move on to his third premise and moving on to his conclusion, establishing the relationship between God and existent beings. He's going to examine this case through necessary and contingent argument. Ibn Arabi says, every contingent entity, and I'm using contingent and created as synonyms, every created entity requires a creator because it doesn't have the contingent entity, the created entity doesn't have an existence from its own. It requires something else to derive existence from. Now, with this in mind, and the relationship between the contingent and that creator is the relationship of need. The contingent entity needs its creator to have existence. From this, he says, therefore, the thing, the entity on which a created entity depends on must be necessary. And by necessary, we mean what is not contingent. That is, an entity or a being whose existence does not depend on some other entity. Consider this, A, B, C, D. They are different entities. A is contingent, created, therefore it doesn't have existence from its own. It goes back to the other one, it goes back to B. And B again is contingent. Let's say human being, I am A. I don't have existence from my own. I go back, let's say to my parents, and they go back and back and back, but it cannot go ad infinitum. It cannot go infinitely. There must be a starting point. That starting point must be necessary. Otherwise, it also be dependent on another entity to exist. And again, that cycle would go on. So there must be a first existent, and that first existent is necessary. That is, it has its existence from its own. So, definition of the necessary. What is creator, says Ibn Arabi, must be necessary. That first cause, that first being. And in its essence, it shouldn't need any other entity to exist. And that is essentially necessary. That is exactly why we say God's knowledge is essentially necessary. And this essentially necessary grants existence and everything to all the created, all the contingent entities. Then Ibn Arabi adds an important premise. Because created entities derive their existence from the necessary, the essentially necessary, they also find the necessity. But their necessity is different from the essentially necessary's necessity. Their necessity does not go back to their own essence. It goes back to another entity's essence. That is the essentially necessary. With the difference being that the essentially necessary, it's not the same for essentially necessary. The essentially necessary does not rely on another entity for its necessity. Its necessity is from its or his own. But for the created entities, it's not like that. They're also necessary, but their necessity essentially depends on another being. In any name or attribute that the created entity derives from the essentially necessary entity, it finds necessity. Ibn Arabi then concludes, because of this, God says to us, to know Him, we need to contemplate the created. Alluding to the Quranic passages where it says, we have put signs in the horizon and within yourselves. So you see, there are signs in the created realm, there are signs within your soul. And Quran, God is pushing us to contemplate the nature, because there he has put his science, because every created entity derives its necessity from the essentially necessary, because every created entity derives its existence from the essentially necessary. Therefore, we found our way to God, that is, we know God through ourselves. The created entities know God through themselves. Any attribute we call him with, we are that attribute. That is, through these attributes we define God, we arrive at God, although these attributes are not going to be capturing him. But through self-knowledge we're going to arrive at God knowledge. And their attributes are the same, although their modes are different, except for one thing, except for the essential necessity that the created beings do not have. And this is one of those passages that make it clear that some who lecture Ibn Arabi saying that your version of the al-wujud is pantheistic. This shows clearly that it's not. Everything in the universe has necessity. Everything in the universe are created in God's image, in a sense, with human having its apex, but they do not have essential necessity. This is the important part. They do not have essential necessity. Because we know him through ourselves, we attribute to ourselves what we attribute to him. God used translators, that is the prophets, to explain this to us, meaning that he explained himself to us through us. He explained himself to us through human attributes. A very important passage now. When we witnessed him, we witnessed ourselves. And when he witnessed himself, he witnessed us. You can replace the word witness with contemplate. In other words, self-knowledge leads us to God knowledge. We know him through ourselves, and he contemplates the essences of his names and attributes through the human being, through the created realm. All the created entities, says Ibn Arabi, the created realm has multiplicity. The created existence are multiple, they are not one. There must be something that distinguishes one from the other. Also, when we say God exists and we exist, and existence is one, but there must be a distinction between his existence and our existence. And there must be a distinction from the previous case between his oneness and the created world's multiplicity. And that distinction is nothing but existence itself, its mode of existence. Our existence, the created being's existence, depends on God's existence, but his existence does not depend on another being's existence. Now, I'm going to be stopping here. I don't want to go further because we're going to enter into something a bit challenging. We have lots of things to contemplate now. Let's go through them in our minds, prepare questions for our live stream. In our next video, we're going to be discussing how, in what sense, the Quran calls God huwa al-awwal wal-akhir wal-zahir wal-batin. He is the first and the last, the outward and the inward. In what sense is he called the first and the last? In the next video, we're going to be examining this. Thank you for watching. See you next time.